Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about leaky lung syndrome, and I'm going to explain to you some of the research behind leaky lungs, and I want to go over what the pathophysiology is, what the mechanism is. I want to explain to you what the symptoms are for people that have this pulmonary or lung permeability, and then I want to talk about what kind of conditions and diseases can cause it, and then what's being done for testing for pulmonary permeability, or we call leaky lung syndrome. That's kind of in the literature. It's referred to as pulmonary epithelium permeability. The slang term for it is leaky lung. Just like with leaky gut syndrome, it's intestinal permeability, and they use the term leaky gut just to make things simple. But when we say the word leaky lung, we're really referring to pulmonary epithelium permeability, and it's a mechanism that's well published in the literature. It's just people don't use the term leaky lung or leaky lung syndrome. So if you're trying to communicate with, let's say, pulmonologists, they may not understand your definition of leaky lung. Just like gastroenterologists for many, many years didn't understand the term leaky gut until it became more and more popular. Okay, so the basic concept is, one of the things that's really critical for everyone to maintain their health is to have healthy barrier systems. And we have barrier systems throughout our body. So we have barriers that keep foreign compounds or the environment out of our body, or less exposed to our immune system in the gut. So that's the gut epithelium barrier. We have it in our brain, the blood-brain barrier, and then we have it in our nasopharynx, our nose respiratory pathways, in our upper respiratory areas, and we also have it in our lungs. And this is the pulmonary epithelium or leaky lungs. So let me just review some really quick lung anatomy with you, and then kind of explain the big concepts. So your lungs are basically, very flexible tissue that's there to take in air and really involved with our ability to take in oxygen and blow out CO2. Now, when you look at these sac-filled organs, think of them as a tree, and then the best way to think about this is to learn the anatomy of the lungs. Just think of the windpipe as a tree trunk. And the windpipe's involved in carrying air into your oxygen, and then the tree trunk branches out, and then these branchioles are called bronchi, and then these branches or bronchi spread out into smaller branches, or these tunnels where air is being transported to your lungs, called bronchioles. And at the end of the bronchiole, there's something called an alveoli, and this alveoli is where you actually have the exchange between oxygen and CO2 and gases and things you inspire. And in this alveoli, you can kind of think of it as like the leaf of the branch. In this alveoli, you have a barrier called the pulmonary epithelium barrier. And this pulmonary epithelium barrier has tight junctions, just like the gut. And there's certain proteins there, and they're referred to as claudin proteins, Cludin proteins. And there's different claudin proteins. There's claudin 3, claudin 4, claudin 5, claudin 8, many different claudin proteins. But those claudin proteins keep the pulmonary barrier intact, so chemicals and pollutants we breathe in don't really get into our lungs and activate our immune response. So basically, when these tight junction proteins in the lung break down, that's so-called leaky lung or pulmonary epithelium permeability. And this is actually very common, and it's really overlooked as a part of chronic disease and chronic triggers for autoimmune patients and chronic inflammation for many people. So just as research continues to show that many people actually have leaky gut syndrome or blood-brain barrier permeability, more and more research is showing that the large majority of people that have chronic inflammatory lung diseases have some degree of leaky lung or lung permeability. And for sure, there are people that have some subtle lung permeability issues that are having symptoms that are subtle, like asthma or other issues. But I think it's an area where more and more research is going to continue to come out. We're going to see the same trends as we saw with leaky gut. Now, in research studies, they're able to do biopsy studies and look at these proteins and see them break down and understand what's happening with them. Different studies have been done with them to find association with inflammation and immune responses in chronic lung diseases. But in a more subtle sense, you can have permeability of the lungs from very simple things just like air pollution. So the best way to think of how the lung barrier breaks down is really no different than the blood-brain barrier, the gut barrier. Chronic inflammation is what's going to break down these barriers. And chronic inflammation or pro-oxidants or oxidative stress, these inflammatory reactions, whether it's from an inflammatory disease or from air pollution or from cigarette smoke, those are going to cause some destruction of these epithelium cells and the tight junction proteins in the lungs. And our only way to combat this is our antioxidant system and something called secretory IgA cells. And secretory IgA cells, we'll talk about a little bit later, they're immune cells. They basically bind to whatever is coming in, like air pollution or chemicals, so it doesn't really cause an inflammatory destructive response against the lungs. And then if that SIgA or secretory IgA cell doesn't engulf the inflammatory chemical, then that chemical or that inflammatory irritant is going to start to cause inflammation or destruction against those tight junction proteins. And when that happens, our antioxidant system, and in the lung, the most studied antioxidant system is the glutathione system, and seems to be plays a very important role in maintaining our lung epithelium. Our lung glutathione epithelium levels then protect for those cells to get damaged. So you could have some people that have really healthy secretory IgA cells in their lungs because their immune system is healthy and they have really healthy antioxidant systems, and they get around cigarette smoke or air pollution and they're fine. And other people that have a compromised barrier and have very low SIgA cells because their immune system is weak, they can get exposed to irritants and chemicals, and then those cases, those tight junctions may break down or already broken down, and these chemicals can get through the lungs and then cause this inflammatory response. Now you have to realize we're inhaling chemicals all the time, so it doesn't have to be, and you don't even see it, doesn't have to be something mysterious. If you can just look at air pollution levels in different regions, there's many different sites and apps that can look at air pollution for whatever zip code you're in and kind of give you an idea of what's happening with the amount of chemicals in the air. But they're everywhere, and we're breathing them all the time, and sometimes air quality is really, really poor, and it's so bad that they report that in the news. And when that happens, people that have intestinal permeability are at risk for having some inflammatory reactions if they breathe the air. And if people have really poor antioxidant systems, if they get exposed to bad air quality, these tight junctions can break down. And then when they break down, this sets up the stage for a significant inflammatory cascade. So the key things to kind of remember as I kind of summarize here, as I kind of teach you step by step, the key concepts is we have these, we breathe in air and blow out CO2, and at the end of the tree, we have these alveoli, and then there's a barrier there. And then that barrier has tight junction proteins called claudin proteins. And then those claudin proteins are very sensitive to anything that is a pro-oxidant, like a chemical or pollutant, or any type of inflammatory response that takes place in the lungs. So things like infections can also break down the lung barrier, and pretty much every inflammatory lung disease like bronchitis or COPD or emphysema that have an inflammatory component to it have been shown to break down the lung barrier system, just like when people have chronic inflammatory gastrointestinal diseases like celiac disease or Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. They all, studies show they have leaky gut, they have intestinal permeability. So if there's an ongoing inflammatory response in the lung from a disease, then we just know that tight junctions are broken down. Now, let's talk about the less subtle ones. The less subtle presentations of leaky lung syndrome, which is really most important for people that are suffering from chronic autoimmune diseases and chronic inflammation, is that when they get exposed to really poor air quality, that's when their symptoms flare up. It's just like if someone had leaky gut, they get exposed to an inflammatory food protein and then they get a reaction with their joints. Let's say that patient has arthritis. So if a patient has arthritis, and they have, let's say they have an autoimmune reaction against their joints, and they have antibodies to collagen peptide, so they have like rheumatoid arthritis, and they have this chronic joint pain. And they know that certain things are going to make their joint pain worse, which are triggers for their immune system. So, for example, many people that have arthritis are very sensitive to nightshades. So if they eat, let's say, tomato or eggplant, they notice significant joint pain because of that. Since that's that immune sensitivity to those food proteins for them. Now, for people that have lung epithelium barrier breakdown, and also have RA, they may just may get exposed to really poor quality air, and all of a sudden their joints really hurt. Or they could be working in a room or in the garage, or working to restore a house or do something, and that air quality really then starts to flare up their joints. So that's the key difference. So whether a person has for example, has rheumatoid arthritis, or they have Hashimoto's disease, or any other type of autoimmune disease, one of the key things that I know I do as a clinician, I always look to determine if there's any clinical patterns of lung epithelium barrier issues. So, and what I find is that many patients don't know. So many patients don't actually know that they may have air pollution, for example, or really trigger them. Some may have found the association with cigarette smoke. They get exposed to cigarette smoke. There's so many chemicals released in cigarettes besides the aspects of tobacco in it that are in the filters that really can be inflammatory for people that have leaky lung syndrome and autoimmunity. So sometimes I'll have patients tell me that they're really sensitive to cigarette smoke. If they're in a room with a lot of cigarette smoke, their autoimmune disease flares up. Maybe it's their joint, maybe it's their thyroid, maybe whatever the tissue protein is under attack. So that's one of the key features that gets overlooked. Now, most people don't know the association with air quality, so they have to start to look at their air quality and start to see if those patterns are there. But that's your biggest clue. So you don't have to have a full-blown expression of a lung disease. Now, they have found studies linking asthma and wheezing with people that have permeability of their lungs, but not all forms of asthma are related to lung permeability. But we know that people that do have lung permeability, they can have wheezing and an inflammatory response and constriction of the bronchi when they have an inflammatory exposure. So the key thing is that if you have an autoimmune disease or suffering from chronic pain or chronic inflammation, and if you know poor air quality or getting around inhalants that could be toxic, let's say chemical based or pollutants, are really causing you to then have a reaction like joint pain or chronic pain afterwards, and it may be that end of that day or the next day, that's a big clue that you may have pulmonary permeability. Now, the other symptoms that typically take place with pulmonary permeability, besides flaring up an autoimmune disease, is just general fatigue. So one of the things that happens is that if you have, let's say, a leaky lung pattern, and you do trigger your immune response by getting exposed to pollutants and inhalants that are very inflammatory, that's going to cause these particles to get through your lungs, and it's going to cause a systemic inflammatory immune response when your whole body is going to get inflamed. And when the whole body gets inflamed and has an inflammatory response, inflammation shuts down or uncouples mitochondria throughout the body. So most people just feel really tired, really fatigued. And it could be muscle fatigue, it could be brain fatigue. It'll have an effect throughout the whole body. So chronic pain, an autoimmune flare-up, general fatigue, brain fog that are triggered by a respiratory trigger are all clues that a person may have leaky lung syndrome. And if you're listening to this and you have an autoimmune disease or a chronic pain syndrome, you may want to be very focused on these mechanisms and know that they may be part of what's triggering your autoimmune disease. What I find is a lot of patients that have autoimmune diseases or chronic pain syndromes, they're focusing so much on dietary foods and not so much on air quality and the fact that their lung permeability may be involved. Okay? Now, what does the literature show? What does the scientific literature show that can cause these tight junctions to break down? Well, any inflammatory disease, again, COPD, emphysema, bronchitis, smokers are going to have permeability of their lung barriers. That's a lot of free radicals that they're exposing to the lung barriers. Areas with high amounts of air pollution, areas with any type of respiratory infection can cause it. Obesity can cause permeability of the blood-brain barrier. One of the things to understand about obesity is that there's a phenomenon called adipocyte inflammation. And what this means is that fat tissue has cells called adipocytes, and adipocytes create inflammatory chemicals, specifically IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And what they found is that the more body fat a person has, the more inflammation they have. And what they found is links with this chronic inflammation and lung permeability. So obesity, and just having more body fat is going to cause the barrier to break down. Diabetes, especially if the HbA1c levels are high, if there's lots of glycation, those lung tight junctions can break down. Malignancies, cancers that cause oxidative stress throughout the body can cause these lung barriers to break down, and just as we get older. Now, what's really interesting is that when you look at the diseases that can cause these pulmonary barriers to break down, they're also the risk factors for people that end up with complications with COVID-19. So COVID-19 risk factors are smoking, diabetes, obesity, just being older, having underlying inflammatory or underlying condition. And there's a possibility, research will show, there's a possibility that some of these patients that may be very susceptible and have chronic diseases and progression into things like antiphospholipid syndrome, where they get clotting with coronavirus, they have already some compromised lung permeability as part of the factor. But in any case, the key thing is that those are the risk factors. So if you're a smoker, you're going to have leaky lung syndrome. If you're constantly in an area where you have lots of air pollution, you can have leaky lung. And by the way, they've also done some studies where they've looked at geographic studies, epidemiological studies, and found where there's the highest rates of severity of COVID-19 in populations, and they found direct links with air pollution. So I think there's some issues with permeability and just our potential to stay healthy and just overall, and especially with this pandemic. Now, how do you test for this? So one of the questions people always ask is, well, how do I confirm I actually have leaky lung syndrome? And this is where we have a problem. So in research studies, what they do is they do a bronchoscopy. They take a little scope in, get some tissues of the alveoli, and then check out the epithelium inside a microscope, and then they can determine pulmonary permeability. So that's how they do it in research studies. And that's not available for us to do in a real life setting yet. There is a clinical trial being done by the University of Rochester where they're doing something called an inhalation challenge test, and they're using that to see if it's an effective test to measure permeability. They've already confirmed that it does. It is a reliable marker with animal studies, but now they're getting to human clinical trials. And what they're doing is they're doing a mannitol challenge, respiratory mannitol challenge. So let me explain this. Long time ago, when they were looking for leaky gut, they used to do a test called a mannitol lactulose test. But mannitol, it was a sugar, and what people would do for this leaky gut test is they would drink this mannitol sugar. And mannitol is a large sugar. It's a disaccharide, so it's pretty large. It shouldn't be able to get through the gut epithelium. So what they would do is they'd have a person consume mannitol in a liquid drink, and then they would measure their urine afterwards, a few hours later, and then determine if mannitol levels spiked up. And if mannitol levels spiked up, that would indicate that they may have malabsorption syndromes. Or they also tested a sugar called lactulose, which shouldn't get through the gut. And if lactulose got through, then they would have leaky gut. Mannitol was this very small sugar. It should be absorbed, but if they had malabsorption from inflammation in their gut, that wouldn't get through. They're doing the same thing with mannitol, but they're having people breathe it in a test, and then they're checking their urine levels. And this is probably gonna pass. It's gonna, as they go through the clinical trials, they'll get the FDA approval. Laboratory tests are much easier to get through FDA than drugs. So in the future, we might see leaky lung tests where people inhale mannitol and then check the urine, and they can see if this sugary inhaled substance actually shows up in the urine. And if it does, then that could be a sign for leaky lung. Now, for now, we don't have any commercial available test. So what we're stuck with is this gap between knowing what the research is on leaky lung syndrome or pulmonary epithelium permeability, and no real available commercial testing to test for it. So we have to kind of figure out symptoms that are associated with it. So again, the key thing is when you suspect this is if you feel an inflammatory response or immune response when you get exposed to air pollution, cigarette smoke, or just bad air quality. Now, then the question comes up, how do you treat it? Well, the key thing is, first of all, you have to reduce systemic inflammation. That's one of the key things. So remember, the only reason the lung barrier or any other barrier in the body is going to break down is that if there's not enough antioxidants to deal with the stress of the inflammation, oxidative stress. So one part of it could be to raise your antioxidant levels. And antioxidants that have really been supportive of lung epithelium barrier regeneration and repair that have been published so far are your typical ones: vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin D, and glutathione. And glutathione can be raised by taking like a liposomal glutathione or things like N-acetylcysteine to raise glutathione. So if your goal is to really repair your lung barrier, you want to take things like N-acetylcysteine or liposomal glutathione, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin D, and just improve your antioxidant reserves. At the same time, you got to reduce your exposure to irritants to your lung barrier. So you really won't need to improve your indoor air. And it's surprising how poor indoor air is for many chronic patients. And if you do have this, if you suspect you have this lung permeability issue, you really should get a HEPA filter, HEPA filter. Those are the only filters that really clean the air well enough so you can get decreased pollutants and irritants to the lung barrier. And then if you are being exposed to dust, or if you are being exposed to an environment that just isn't healthy, you should have a dust mask. I mean, the N95 masks are great, but we know we have some issues with that with the pandemic. But any kind of dust mask, especially a really good quality N95 mask, would be ideal to reduce this. And then many people have been using nebulized glutathione, and nebulized glutathione requires a nebulizer. And in most states and countries, you have to get a prescription for a nebulizer. And a nebulizer will take a medication or antioxidant that's a liquid and then vaporize it into a gas, and people wear masks and then breathe in and then bring in glutathione. So those are the main strategies to try to support the barrier, the lung barrier itself. All right, so I think that's kind of the baseline of the key concepts of leaky lung and lung barrier syndrome issues. And I'm going to take some questions here. My wife's going to help me. But also, if you haven't already followed us on Facebook, you might want to follow us. We also have created a YouTube channel under my name, so we post some of these old videos. If you missed any of them on our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to that. And I write new information articles all the time on my website called Dr. K News, drknews.com. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me. I see people from all over, from UK, Australia, from Florida, from Canada, from all over the US. So thank you everyone for taking the time to join. So let's get into some questions.
Okay, hi. Asuka asks, what does uncoupled mitochondria mean?
Sorry, I didn't explain that very well. So uncoupled mitochondria, what does that mean? Well, you have the factory of energy in all of your cells is called mitochondria, and what they produce is something called ATP. And ATP is basically the fuel for all your cells. And there are certain physiological mechanisms that makes this energy powerhouse not work, and that's called mitochondrial uncoupling. So one of the things that causes this energy powerhouse of the cell to not work is chronic inflammation. So inflammation starts to impact what are these different enzymes in this powerhouse of the cell called mitochondria, called complex enzymes. And then these become less efficient, and the body makes less cell fuel called ATP. So chronic inflammation has been known to cause what they call mitochondrial uncoupling, which basically means that chronic inflammation shuts down your body's ability to make energy. And it's very common with people that have chronic diseases. Most people that have chronic inflammatory diseases, they just don't recover. They feel tired. They can't exercise. If they exercise, they can't perform well with it. And once they get through their exercise, it's really, really hard to go back and recover from it. Those are all clinical signs of mitochondrial uncoupling.
Okay, Nancy asks, how do you lower your eosinophils?
Well, if you have high eosinophils are immune-specific cells. When you ever do, for those of you that don't know what eosinophils are, if you ever had a blood test, they measure your white blood cell count. They'll test different immune cells, and one of them are eosinophils. And eosinophils are triggered by very specific IgE antibody response and a cytokine called IL-4. And when eosinophils are elevated, you have to look for basically actual allergies, not sensitivities, and they could be environmental. They could be, you know, different types of pollen in the air or different types of airborne triggers that you can have an allergic reaction to raise your eosinophils. And there's also research that shows parasitic infections activate the same pathway and they can raise eosinophils. And there are also some really common chronic inflammatory bowel diseases that can raise eosinophils, other lung and bowel disease that can raise eosinophils. So at the end of the day, it just means that you have either a significant inflammatory response or some kind of allergy or some kind of parasitic infection. You have to find out what that is. You can't just treat elevated eosinophils with a supplement. You got to find the cause of it and then address that to reduce your eosinophils.
Okay, Meredith asks, does mold exposure cause leaky lung?
Yes, so mold exposure can absolutely cause leaky lung. It would just be another inflammatory compound. We did a talk on mold. And one of the key things to remember about mold is that mold produces what are called mycotoxins. And these mycotoxins are released into the air and we breathe them. And these mycotoxins are severely inflammatory and they will cause irritation and breakdown of tight junction proteins and cause alveoli inflammation. So if you're in a chronically mold or mycotoxin rich environment, like you're breathing in all the time, I just think it's a matter of time before the lung barrier breaks down. It really depends on how healthy your immune system is and how healthy your antioxidant systems are. For some people, if those systems are already compromised, they can have severe reactions to mold. And for some people, those systems are intact. And even though they're getting mycotoxin exposure, their antioxidant repair of their lung barrier is so fast. And their secretory IgA cells that are these immune cells that just take up the mycotoxin and prevent its destruction on tissues. If those are intact, you're not going to have any symptoms. And this is why some people could live in a house and be exposed to mold. And let's say one person in the family is like, I don't know what you're complaining about, I feel fine. And then someone else has a significant issue with it and they feel sick. So, it's not just the mold exposure. One of the other key factors is how your body responds to the mold or mycotoxin exposure, and the lung barrier is one of the key factors there.
Okay. Julie asks, why might one react to glutathione?
Yeah, there are some people who don't do well with glutathione, and the key reaction there is usually with the sulfur portion of glutathione. So some people are just intolerant to sulfur. And if you're intolerant to sulfur, you're not going to be able to take N-acetylcysteine or glutathione. And you're going to have to use things like vitamin C, selenium to really raise your glutathione levels, or just use other antioxidants.
Okay, Jonathan asks, what kinds of diet or foods will exacerbate leaky lungs, and which ones will improve and get rid of leaky lungs?
So what type of diet and foods will help heal leaky lung and help cause it to break or promote its breakdown? Well, I think the key thing is just inflammation. So if the diet's inflammatory, that's where the risk is. So, for example, some people are extremely sensitive to milk protein and some people are not. If a person is sensitive to milk protein and they get a systemic inflammatory response, that's going to use up their antioxidant reserves. That's going to potentially lower their SIGA count throughout their body. So their severe reaction to milk protein may be a big issue for their lung barrier to break down. Whereas for someone else who doesn't have that severe reaction, it may not be as bad. Same thing could be happening with people that have nightshade sensitivities or reaction to lectin proteins. Technically foods like lectins, like peas and corn and eggplant, tomato, these things are considered healthy vegetables and foods. But for some people, they're not because they have a significant inflammatory response. So the key thing is whatever diet has an anti-inflammatory effect on them is probably the best way to support the lung barrier. But any diet that promotes inflammation and based on their own individual unique reactions to food proteins would be a factor in causing the lung barrier to break down simply by just reducing antioxidant reserves and causing systemic inflammation. So the key concept also is when a person has inflammation, we all have some inflammation, but if our inflammation in our body is severe throughout our body and we're dealing with a chronic inflammatory condition or disease, for example, like celiac disease or autoimmune disease or inflammatory bowel disease or whatever type of inflammatory condition, all barriers have have a chance for greater permeability, whether it's a nasopharynx barrier in our nose, or blood-brain barrier, or a gut barrier, or a lung barrier. So inflammation in the body generally will be the key risk factor for causing all barriers to break down. So the diet you want to choose is one that's not inflammatory for that individual person.
Okay. Lynn asks, can you speak to the optimal levels of antioxidants? What do you think are optimal levels of antioxidants?
So, no, it's really hard to answer that question. But what are the optimal levels of antioxidants? Because which antioxidant, which tissue, how much? What you're measuring in blood, reflective of what's happening in tissue? So we don't know. Some people have reference ranges for things like vitamin A and vitamin E on red blood cell testing when they test micronutrients. Some people look at, some labs look at the ratios between oxidized or reduced glutathione to get a general clue about antioxidants. But those are really not really clear indications. To be quite honest, the amount of antioxidants you need, you definitely want to eat superfoods that are really high in antioxidants. Very colorful fruits, colorful vegetables are really high in antioxidant content. You really want to consume a lot of those. And then you may want to just take antioxidants. Things like resveratrol, turmeric, just as a preventative thing. I think for most people, if cost is not an issue and they're like pro-health and pro-supplements, taking a variety of things like turmeric, resveratrol, pomegranate, green tea, really provide really rich sources of antioxidants. How much do you need? And then the issue always becomes cost versus benefit. You're going to figure out how much do you take and how much does it cost you if you're taking exogenous supplement, if you're taking oral supplements. And that's basically where most people's decision comes in. So we don't really have a really good way of testing. So we're dealing with cost benefit issues all the time. Now, in a clinical setting, sometimes when people have chronic inflammation, we'll kind of raise up their glutathione or their resveratrol or green tea or whatever antioxidants we're using until they see a benefit. And for some patients, they're going to tell you, I have to take this amount of green tea extract every single morning in order to feel better. And for some people, they don't even respond to green tea extract. They'll respond to resveratrol. So there is some, in the real world, trial and error in playing around with different antioxidants. So that's the best way I can answer your question.
Okay. Susan asks, what is the best way to access the SIGA status?
So SIGA is called secretory IgA. I mentioned it a few times. So secretory IgA is an immunoglobulin, like an antibody, but it circulates on the surface of the gut barrier, and it surfaces on the nasopharynx barrier and in the lung barrier. And what these SIGA immunoglobulins do is when a pathogen or a pollutant comes in, they just surround it. And when they engulf it, they kind of neutralize it from reacting against the barrier. Now, that can be measured in blood, it can be measured in saliva, and it can be measured in stool. But how you measure it really reflects on what you're trying, which target tissue you're trying to look at. I think for the lung epithelium and the gut epithelium, saliva SIGA is a very accurate way to measure it, and many labs offer that test. And for general immune compromise, you're going to see the serum SIGA levels drop. Stool SIGA is probably just best when you're trying to look at the gut epithelium, the gastrointestinal epithelium, not so much for the lung epithelium. So I would say saliva would be a really good way. Saliva secretory IgA is a really good way to look at that SIGA count. And if you do have signs and patterns of lung permeability, you can use that test to see if that's improving or not with you.
Okay, then Laura asks, how do you increase secretory IgA levels that are low?
So the way you can increase secretory IgA levels when they're low is the same thing as we talked about. Taking high amounts of antioxidants, reducing inflammatory load, making sure your immune system is healthier, getting plenty of sleep and rest are key patterns. Secretory IgA have been linked to stress, and psychological stress has been shown to rapidly deplete SIGA levels. So the psychoneuroimmune response is found to be very significant with SIGA levels. So basically, it's really no different than anything else. Reduce your stress, get plenty of sleep, get tons of antioxidants, um, get your immune system as healthy as you can. Those are ways to raise your SIGA levels. I do want to point out something. There are many laboratories that are doing SIGA incorrectly. And if you're getting SIGA levels measured with a lab test that's also measuring your hormones, like an adrenal cortisol profile or a female hormone profile, unless they gave you a separate vial for SIGA, that's going to be a test that's not accurate. You have to have different reagents to stabilize SIGA than what's used for hormone testing. So be aware of that. If you're not doing it, if you're getting your SIGA levels measured when you did a hormone test in the same vial, you probably did not get an accurate level of measuring.
Okay. So Deirdre asks, if you have multiple chemical sensitivities, does that mean you have leaky lung?
If you have multiple chemical sensitivities, does that mean you have leaky lung? No. It's possible. So when you have multiple chemical sensitivities, that's what's referred to as loss of chemical tolerance. And when you lose chemical tolerance, there's lots of things that can happen. One of the mechanisms is that the barrier can break down. That could be your lung barrier, could be your gut barrier, your blood-brain barrier, or your nasopharynx barrier. Another part of it is you can have what are called dendritic cells that overreact, or Treg cells that dysfunction. So there's a whole list of different immune mechanisms that are involved from having you to have an overreaction to chemicals. I did create a online program called the 3D Immune Tolerance Protocol. The 3D stand for Diversify, Distinguish, and Downregulate. If you go to drknews, drknews.com, you can enroll in that course, and it goes through all the different mechanisms and physiology of how you lose tolerance and how people develop either food or chemical sensitivity. And I think you'll find that information really useful to you if you're suffering from chemical sensitivity.
Okay. Michael asks, what is better or more preferred test, CRP or homocysteine?
What is the preferred?
Which is a better or more preferred
What
test?
is a better or preferred test, CRP or homocysteine? Well, they're measuring different things, so there isn't one that's better or preferred. CRP is going to measure just a general marker for systemic inflammation, and what happens with C-reactive protein is when you have inflammation, your immune cells produce called cytokines. Those cytokines then trigger immune responses to cause inflammation, but those cytokines end up in the liver, and they get metabolized to an end product by the liver called C-reactive protein. That's what they measure. And the key thing you need to know about that is that not all inflammatory responses are going to go through that pathway. So many people have systemic and chronic inflammation, and the CRP levels may be fine. So it's not a test to measure all inflammation in the body. It's just one marker. Homocysteine is a completely different mechanism. Homocysteine isn't measuring these end products of these cytokine proteins. Homocysteine is measuring the body's ability to methylate. Homocysteine is an inflammatory chemical that our body makes just normally, and it eventually gets converted to cysteine and cysteine, which are very important for many metabolic processes in our body. And the conversion of homocysteine that's inflammatory to cysteine that's not requires a transfer of a one carbon group they call a methyl group, so they call that a methylation pathway. And when you're trying to see if someone has a methylation problem where they need things like folate or B12, that's where you would measure homocysteine. So they're totally different tests.
Okay, so the person who asked you about how to test for SIGA, she and a few other people are saying that's exactly how they got their results from the thing, so they'll retest. And then a follow-up is, any labs you recommend, or how do you test?
Because if you had your hormone levels measured through a lab that was doing your hormones, let me guess your results. It was low. Let me guess your follow-up. It's still low. Let me guess your next follow-up. It's still low. This is why I get so upset with some of these functional medicine labs that just, I don't know what they're doing. Test with Cyrex Labs, to saliva SIGA. Get a reliable test. They actually use reagents to measure a chemical. That's the one I use. There could be other labs that are doing it properly. But a lot of these hormone labs are just throwing that in to make their profiles look better. And you're going to be like so frustrated because you're going to see it low, you're never going to see it go up, and you're not actually getting an accurate test. And if people in the lab were listening to this, wake up, read the literature, create the right reagents, and make your panels appropriate for actually measuring SIGA.
Okay.
It's frustrating for everyone.
I I know. I'm glad you said that. Okay. So sorry, Michael, who asked about the CRP versus homocysteine question, he said it was for systemic inflammation.
Yeah, for systemic inflammation, again, CRP, they're both part of systemic inflammation. When you have systemic inflammation, you're looking for all different mechanisms and triggers. So CRP can be a useful tool. The most common test people are using for systemic inflammation would be CRP or ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. You can also see markers like ferritin go up. These are called acute phase reactants. They just go up in the inflammatory response. So if you were just screening for systemic inflammation as a biomarker, I would check CRP, I would check ESR, and I would check ferritin. And if once I found one of those high, that would be the baseline I would use with someone, and then I would do follow-ups to see if those levels are coming down. You might not see your CRP high, but you might see your ESR high. You might not see your ESR high, but you might see your ferritin high. So what I typically do is those 3 screens, and then once I get a baseline of which inflammatory pathway I'm kind of seeing some changes in, I can use that to compare them over time with any kind of protocol or intervention.
Okay, Bob is asking, is SIGA different from IgGA, for example?
Yes, so SIGA is different than IgG.
IgGA.
I don't know what IgGA is.
It might be a typo.
So maybe typo. Okay, so there's different immunoglobulins. There's IgA, IgG, IgM, IgA, and they all have different immune responses. So IgG is typically involved with your classical antibody response when you're reacting to a food, protein, or a chemical that's delayed. IgA is really the immunoglobulin that's in your barriers trapping different food protocols and pathogens to dampen the immune reaction to it.
Okay.
And I'm generalizing. There's a lot more, but...
Okay. So someone's asking if you can do a talk on histamine.
I can do a talk on
histamine intolerance. A video on histamine intolerance.
Yeah. We can do one on it. We have a list we're trying to go through. Right now we've been trying to cover the barrier. So last time we covered the blood-brain barrier, and then today we're talking about the lung barrier, and then next time we're going to talk about the gut barrier and really talk about all the current research and talk about how it's not as simple as just doing the leaky gut protocol. But thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. Nisi asks, Dr. K, do genetic tests help with designing an anti-inflammation diet? If so, do you have one you recommend?
So genetic testing has a long way to go, and does genetic testing really help to calm down?
Design the anti-inflammation diet.
Design anti-inflammation diet.
And if so, which do you like?
Okay, so the problem with genetic testing is they're measuring individuals, what they call SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And the ones that the labs are testing are really the ones that are commercially available and cheap to test. They're not testing all of them. It's not like strategic where they figured out which SNPs to measure for everything and they're measuring all of them. They don't have the ability to do that. Labs, there's thousands of these SNPs. There's going to, in the reality of genetic testing, you're going to measure all your SNPs, not just a few. They're going to do machine learning to see how these things work, which they're still understanding. And then once they have those SNPs, then they can really find some protocols. Now, that being said, there are some single nucleotide polymorphisms that do show evidence that by themselves they are an issue. Like, for example, MTHFR, methyl-tetrahydrofolate reductase polymers, the inability to methylate has been shown some strong research. So that individual SNP by itself could be a factor for like B12 or folate. But when you see some of these labs like breaking down just like one SNP for glutathione and one SNP for a sulfation pathway, that is literally a joke. That is basically, once again, lab people don't know what they're doing. They're trying to make a commercial test that doesn't really clinically answer the reality of the science behind it. You need, with the exception of some COMT SNPs and MTHFR SNPs, some of the things associated with AP proteins, we don't have enough information to know what those other ones are. So I don't personally do a lot of SNP testing. I find the panels that they're doing are very, very limited. I will test things like MTHFR or CM2 or the ApoE proteins just as a routine, as a common test, but I don't do these full profiles where they measure SNPs and then customize a nutritional protocol. I think those are inefficient, inaccurate ways of doing it. So that's the best I can do to answer your question.
Okay, Sean asks, What are you recommending as preventative measures for maintaining healthy lung barrier, especially during the COVID crisis, and any particular supplements?
Well, I think for the lung barrier in COVID, I think it's the same thing as antioxidants. Glutathione keeps popping out all over the place. There was a brilliant summary review paper and articles published by some of the researchers at one of the Russian universities where they broke down all the science behind how important glutathione is for maintaining lung barrier and its potential role of people suffering severe reactions to COVID-19 versus not. They theorize glutathione may play a role. I would agree with that could be part of the picture. We don't know. It's just opinion. But the key things is basically high antioxidants, A, C, E, D, glutathione, clean indoor air, plenty of sleep, plenty of rest, healthy immune system. There's no real major secret or breakthrough that we know about so far.
Okay. Carolyn, does very low nitric oxide pose a problem to causing all the things you were talking about? My whole body is filled with inflammation.
Yeah, so low nitric oxide, and we're talking about different types of nitric oxide. There's endothelial nitric oxide, there's neuronal nitric oxide, there's cytokine-inducible nitric oxide. There's different types of nitric oxides. But you're probably referring to endothelial nitric oxide. Endothelial nitric oxide is important for blood flow, vasculation, and circulation. And that will definitely impact all your barriers from healing because you got to have healthy amounts of vascular dilation and blood flow to be able to heal and repair. And in the literature, what they found that things that can really increase nitric oxide, one of them is arginine. I personally don't like to use arginine because arginine also activates the inflammatory isomer or branch of nitric oxide. But beet extract has been shown to very profoundly raise nitric oxide levels. Hawthorn extract as a botanical, and vinpocetine. So beet extract, hawthorn extract, vinpocetine are all botanicals that can help with raising nitric oxide and also improving blood flow and circulation, which may be things you may want to consider.
How about your thoughts on, Jody asks, how about your thoughts on astragalus?
Astragalus is not I'm not aware of astragalus being a very powerful nitric oxide stimulator.
In life, astragalus.
Oh, well, astragalus is the key mechanism of astragalus is, well, at least the one that's published, there's probably many mechanisms for astragalus, but the main one is that it helps activate natural killer cells. It's a very good botanical to really improve your immune system. There's different parts of the immune system. The cytotoxic T cell part, where you actually kill infections and pathogens, would be where astragalus would really come in.
Okay, so back to testing again. Susan says, I actually tested low on SIGA with a stool test and was curious whether to also test saliva and or redo the stool test. I have IBS, Hashimoto's, cigarette smoke really bothers me.
So
thanks for the saliva test caveat.
Yeah, so if you had a stool SIGA test that's low, that's probably going to be a very good reflection of what's happening in your gut. It may not be the best reflection of what's happening in your lungs. I would just say you might want to do a saliva SIGA test also to determine if that's happening. Or you may just want to kind of treat your gut for a while, get the inflammation down in your body, and then go from there. Because you're, having gut inflammation and a low SIGA cell count in your gut means you're dealing with some immune challenges in your gastrointestinal microbiome, so you might want to get those under control.
Okay, people are asking if you can do a talk on methylation and mast cells.
Okay.
Debbie, when would you not do intermittent fasting?
When would you not do intermittent fasting? Oh, well, there's a lot of reasons you wouldn't do it. You don't like to do it. Intermittent fasting for sure is so much great research, more and more coming out all the time of how it helps protect the brain, how it helps with controlling blood sugar and diabetes, how it helps calm inflammation. So for all those reasons, there's a lot of good evidence that it can be beneficial to many people. The issue is there are some people who can't jump into intermittent fasting. I think that's the key problem. If they try to do intermittent fasting, they get severely hypoglycemic, they fall apart, and they're not actually able to do it, and they have to be carried through that process. And and people that have significant high insulin levels, like they're insulin resistant, are going to have a really hard time, for example, jumping into it, because their insulin levels shut down a pathway that's called lipolysis, breaking down fat. And since that insulin, since their insulin is high throughout most of the day, because they maybe eat too much sugar and too much carbohydrates and everything, and their pathways to break down fat, this lipolysis pathway is inefficient. So when you go into a fasting state, you're trying to get into ketosis and activate that system, and it just might not be there for them. So a lot of times if people can't, if they want to do intermittent fasting and they can't do it, I'll have them first cut off sugar. That'll start calming down their insulin, and that's a good place to start. Then get into ketogenic and ketosis for a while, and then eventually have that transition to intermittent fasting. But if you bring up what are the health benefits of intermittent fasting, there's a lot of health benefits there. Everyone should be doing it, just like everyone should be exercising, and everyone should be sleeping, and everyone should have healthy social relationships. So the research is there. It's just, do you do it, and are people willing enough to make that sacrifice? Just like, are people willing enough to wake up every day and go exercise? It's hard to do, but it has a lot of benefits.
Okay. Brandon asks, I have read studies on ashwagandha and olive leaf extract being good for mast cell stabilizers. Mm-hmm. Any experience with this? A lot of mast cell questions.
Yeah, a lot of mast cell questions. Olive leaf extract and ashwagandha. Well, they both have anti-inflammatory properties. So whether it's mast cell activation syndrome or histamine response, they're gonna have some benefits. I personally have not used those two compounds for a mast cell response, so I can't comment on it. My guess would be that it may be beneficial, but I haven't researched papers or read papers on it, and haven't looked for those papers, and have no experience with it, so I can't answer it for you. So I'm going to say I don't know.
Okay.
My guess is it'll probably be useful.
Okay. Good. Let's see. Dun dun dun. Okay, Tammy asks, ideas to reduce mucus in the lungs and throat from asthma.
Well, if you have mucus in the lungs from asthma, then that mucus is being produced by an inflammatory response. So you got to reduce the inflammatory triggers. Everything we talked about for lung epithelium barrier applies. So having a healthy HEPA filter, taking lots of antioxidants, or a good place, making sure you're wearing a dust mask if you're around a lot of dust or air pollutants, maybe even nebulized glutathione may be useful. But you got to find the main trigger. Mucus is an inflammatory response, so something is triggering the inflammation. And there's also the possibility of infections too. So you have to look at the big picture and try to strengthen the immune system. Those are just the general concepts. Is there's going to be some trial in a real clinical setting. There's some trial and error. There's some testing. You see what the person responds to. You try to find as many things to remove and add, and it may take some time to figure out, but that's the only way to do it.
Okay. Steph Sinclair says, how do you test endothelial nitric oxide levels?
Yeah, there's some controversy between this. There's some labs that can measure some of these in serum. How accurate and reliable they are is still being tested. So I would say I don't feel too confident about testing him. I don't use it in my office, but there are people that I know that do the testing that I think are pretty smart. So I don't know what to do.
Okay. Let's see. I think that might be it.
That's it.
Let me just do it quickly. Jonathan, can low stomach acid cause leaky lungs? If so, will taking HCl fix this?
So low stomach acid isn't going to directly cause leaky lung. Low stomach acid can cause you to not digest your proteins and have gastral reflux and if you have undigested proteins and leaky gut, maybe that causes inflammation, promotes leaky lung. But lack of HCl itself is not going to be major. It's not going to be a direct cause of leaky lung syndrome.
Okay, let me feel like really fast at the bottom because someone skipped up. Okay, Richard asks, how do leaking lungs / gut affect someone with giant cell arteritis? And how do you calm the flare?
Well, if you have giant cell arteritis, how does leaky lung and leaky gut impact it?
Yeah, affected.
Well, giant cell arteritis, you're looking at the most common cause being an autoimmune response to vascular target proteins. So anything you can do to calm down your hyperactive immune response or systemic inflammation would be a good idea. So just like any other autoimmune disease, the barriers are important, antioxidants important, whatever you can do to work to dampen the autoimmune reaction. And in those cases, you really might want to work with a skilled functional medicine practitioner to help you guide you through maybe an autoimmune diet and lifestyle to calm down that potential inflammatory trigger.
Okay, and
yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
It's a phospholipid autoimmune disorder that is pretty serious.
Other people are just saying thank you. I think that might be it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. I hope you found some information useful. And thanks again. And please follow us on Facebook and our YouTube channel, and check out Dr. K News and our newsletter there. Thanks again.